appears to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office. Experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
For insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all. In-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths.
We hold these truths.
with Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
Hey everybody, welcome back. Really special episode today, and this is going to be in-depth. This is going to be a really smart conversation because I got a really smart guy with me, Dinesh D'Souza. Dinesh, thank you so much for being on the show.
Hey, looking forward to it. Thanks for having me.
So you're a pretty well-known figure, but I'm not so sure everybody knows your history in academia. You came here. How old were you when you came to the United States?
I was 17. I came on a Rotary scholarship and a youth exchange program. I lived in Arizona over a year with 4 American families. I went to high school, 12th grade. And then I applied to college, got into Dartmouth, and basically never went home.
Yeah, well, this is your new home, and the Houston area is also your new home. Am I allowed to tell people that?
No, you are.
I mean, it's a big place. They can't find you.
Yeah, so actually I went to Dartmouth, then I worked in journalism for a little bit. I was a young policy analyst in the Reagan White House for 2 years. And then I spent about 20 years in the think tank world. First AEI, the American Enterprise Institute, then the Hoover Institution. So I've run across and been close to a whole bunch of characters from John Bolton to Judge Bork, Gene Kirkpatrick, Irving Kristol, Milton Friedman, a lot of the sort of conservative luminaries and some slightly more shady characters.
But okay, so you came from, at the time, India. I don't know Indian history very, very well, but I know that it was a deeply socialist country for a while and eventually grew out of that. And did you grow up in that time or was...
Absolutely. So the Indian independence leaders got their socialism not from Russia, but from England, believe it or not. It was the last export of colonialism. The Indians went to Oxford and Cambridge, and there were these Fabian socialists, so-called, the Bernard Shaw school of socialism. And so all of them came back with big socialist ideas. India had all these idiotic 5-year plans. For me as a kid, what I remember are 3 things. One, we had a ration card. So basically you could buy so much rice, sugar, cooking oil. Number 2, corruption everywhere, woven into the fabric of Indian life. And 3, our family was on a 7-year wait to get a phone. Think about that.
Yeah.
Phones were controlled by the government, and it took you basically 7 years to get one.
Jeez. And so I'm sure that experience had a deep influence on you. And you've just written a book, United States of Socialism. It seems like you're a bit worried that brand of socialism, or any brand of socialism for that matter, might come to the United States. And so we're going to talk about that. It's a great book. It's well referenced, a lot of history behind it, and I think you also dive really well into the psychology behind socialism. And so, but you know what I want to start with, and I told you before we started recording, which was, what is your process when you write a book?
I usually start by...
Because you've written a lot, right? And I want to, going into your bio again, how many books have you written?
This will be, I think, number 18, thereabouts. So I started...
Only 18.
Had 4 movies with a 5th one coming out. But anyway, my first book was on political correctness, called Illiberal Education, 1991. So I've been putting out a book every year to 2 years. And my process of writing is I try to write for a general interest audience. So I'll try to find an idea that really stimulates and provokes me, a big question typically, and that's not being answered in the right way.
Yeah.
So just to take socialism for a moment, the standard conservative line on socialism has been something like this: it's never worked before, so what makes us think it's going to work now?
Right.
And I thought, well, that's inadequate. It's not wrong. It's true.
Yeah.
It hasn't worked before. But first of all, a lot of young people don't really know that or know why.
Or they don't believe you.
They don't believe you. Or second, they think they've got all kinds of new ideas up their sleeves and new socialism that will be exempt from those problems. So I find a big idea that's interesting, arresting, and then I ask, is this an idea that the audience would go for? In other words, I pay attention, like any entrepreneur should, to the consumers of the product and say, is this a topic of wide interest? does this seem to tap a chord in what people are thinking about? And if it does, then I'm off to the races. I then take on that topic. I spend a lot of time just sort of reading and formulating my ideas. I kind of do a table of contents to guide that reading.
Yeah. Is it a pretty detailed outline that you write? There's a lot of I hear different things from different writers.
Well, it's not that detailed. It's typically each chapter frames a question.
Yeah.
So a question in socialism might be something like, so what about Scandinavia?
Yeah.
You know, after all, that seems to be the place where socialism works. And it's whatever you think of Scandinavia, it's not a bad place, right? You have people there, you know, named Sven, and they eat some fish, but by and large, they have a pretty good life. So that can't be that bad. So I'll think of myself, well, all right, so let me do Scandinavia, because that really is something that needs to be addressed.
So it's almost like a series of research papers that you end up, at least for this book. I
mean,
maybe every book's just different.
No, they all follow this kind of pattern.
Okay.
And so I might do a couple of chapters that are historical, addressing, again, it's not potted history, like what happened next, but rather there's a historical question here that needs to, and so the history is mobilized to address that point. And then I look at the payoff of the book, sort of the take-home value, what Lyndon Johnson used to call the "and therefore what," you know, and that's, I want to leave the audience with.
So what? Well,
the implication.
That should be a rule in every writing, and it's often not.
And it's often not.
And it makes for bad books. Because like when I write, I basically word vomited for 8 hours, you know, or whatever it is. Get an entire chapter out and then rework it for months, I think. And so I'm not one of those people who could write like 1,000 words a day in a very, you know, mostly because of my job. There's just no way.
Right. No, I mean, I do the opposite. I spend more time planning and thinking about it, and then I pretty much write it straight through, and the final book is not that different from what I write at the beginning. It's that's because I write each sentence carefully. I sit around and think about it. Sometimes I'm mulling over a word, and so when I put it down, I do go back through it, but I never really rewrite.
It's interesting. I've heard of that technique also, but I had no idea how I would do it, but I ended up doing it exactly the opposite. Anyway. The reason, I don't need to ask you why you wrote this book. It's pretty obvious to me and all the listeners, but maybe let's go over some of the concerns that we have, because socialism was a pretty dirty word for Democrats not that long ago. I don't think Barack Obama ever would have campaigned on any notion of socialism. He would have run away from it completely. Frankly, I think he still kind of does, but that party was pretty far left. I don't even know where we're at now. And they certainly don't run away from it. And if anything, they're trying to figure out how to embrace it properly without alienating too many kind of, you know, moderate liberals out here in the suburbs. So,
well, there was a moment. There was a moment in the Democratic primaries where one of the journalists popped the question: "Are you afraid of democratic socialism overtaking the Democratic Party?" And if I remember it, first of all, there was a dead silence for several telling seconds. Amy Klobuchar made a kind of a mild protest, but everybody else was pretty much with the program.
Yeah.
Andrew Yang, they had no problem with.
Very telling.
Very telling.
And I mean, Andrew Yang he's a UBI. It's hard to think of a more obvious socialist policy. But all of these people, they're not running away from the idea at all. And so, you know, there's plenty of statistics too. I don't know if you have them memorized, but they're here in your book about how popular it is with young people and Democrats.
Yes, exactly. And I think the reason for this is not merely that young people, you know, sort of don't know history. It's that young people have been relentlessly propagandized on this topic.
Right.
They've been propagandized both negatively and positively. So the negative side is capitalism is evil, and that the capitalist is a bad guy. You know, his motives are suspect. And that not only does capitalism produce inequality, those arguments are on the periphery. The central argument is that capitalism does not give people their due.
Yeah.
And that's a critical argument because it throws the whole economic system of the United States that the country was founded on into question. And I must say that it's an argument that's not easy to refute, and it's not one that is often refuted at all. In fact, even if you go back and read Adam Smith Adam Smith actually defends capitalism, the system, but he doesn't really defend the capitalist. In fact, he says some pretty negative things about businessmen, selfish, always plotting against the common good, and he implies that the sort of invisible hand of competition mysteriously channels self-interest toward the material welfare of society, but there's no moral defense of the guy who starts a business.
Right.
And to say why that guy is a good guy and is contributing to society and is getting his just desserts. So this is a task I take on later on in the book after the critique of socialism, the moral defense of capitalism.
Yeah, but first they have to tear it down and convince you that it's bad and that it's evil and that it's inherently unjust. And they believe this. So there's a lack of gratitude that has been, I think, infiltrating young minds for a long time. There's another theory that I also like. This was written, I can't remember. I did a podcast. Anyway, it doesn't matter. The theory goes like this. Basically, there was the boomer socialism created millennial socialism. And it's not that hard to tease this out. Boomer socialism is Medicare, Social Security, Medicaid, these vast entitlement programs. And you dive into these later in the book, and we'll get to that. Because they are sort of the beginnings of the progressive/socialist era. But millennials see this, and they're like, there's two options here. The millennials could either say, hey, these are not sustainable programs. These are irresponsible programs. It's the Ponzi scheme, as you note in your book, that Social Security technically is, just by definition. And it's not fair, and we have to rein those in because my generation has to pay for it. Or they could say, if you're getting this, I want this, right? Free healthcare, education, housing, because these are things that millennials have genuine complaints about. Like these are higher costs relative to our parents on those three major things. While maybe everything else in life is much better, those three things are more expensive. Millennials feel unfair about this. Yeah,
and they're right to feel that, by the way, because if you think about those institutions in particular, they're all areas where markets don't work well. Mm-hmm. So take education. Most people who are the consumers of it, the students, aren't the ones paying, at least not paying directly. Their parents are paying, the government is paying, the college knows the government is paying $10,000 Pell Grants and so on. So the colleges realize we don't have to care about inflation. Inflation is 2%. We'll raise our prices 10% every year.
Right.
So it becomes ridiculous. And the students get saddled with all this debt. Then we turn to healthcare. Pretty much the same story, right? I mean, you go into the doctor, I've got a pain in my chest. Okay, I'm going to run 17 tests. It never occurs to you to say, well, how much do these tests cost? Are they all equally important? Can we do 3 tests? Don't you kind of know what I have? But the reason you don't ask is you're not paying. Some other guy's paying. So if you introduce that principle into other areas, you discover the same craziness. I mean, just think about it this way. Imagine if we declared that just like healthcare, eating food is a right. And you told people, listen, when you go to the grocery store, you have an entitlement. You can pretty much collect the food you want, put it in your cart, and you don't have to pay. Right? What would people do? Instead of getting 2 cartons of milk, you get 10. You show up with this gigantic full cart, and then the grocery store realizes, hey, that guy is not paying. So why should we charge $2.40 for milk? How about $25? So what's going on here really is a kind of a collusion scheme between the grocery store and the consumer to rip off a third man, the taxpayer, who's not present, who's not involved in this negotiation. Yeah. So we would have an incredible spiral in food prices for the simple reason that the market has really broken down. So the solution is obviously to move more in the direction of free markets. It is, and we just haven't done a great job of teaching young people that. And so and Democrats are very good at basically saying the simplest possible solution to a problem we might even agree exists. Hey, drug prices are too high. Okay, force them to be lower. Well, that seems a little too good to be true. Just force them to be lower? Really? No consequences to that? Like no second and third order effects? Well, although I think this is a key point, and that is that in the university, these debates do not happen because the premise is moved right past. It's moved right past. Yeah. And so the critical thinking, the Socratic reasoning, the kind of essence of the university is now largely gone. I mean, when I was a student at Dartmouth, the college was left. The students were left, the faculty was left, but there was a conservative presence. And so I could have named off the top of my head 5 prominent conservative professors at Dartmouth. I could have named 5 at Harvard. Yeah. But now when I go to campuses, I'm hard-pressed to find one. Yeah. And if there's one, he's hiding under his desk and not identifying himself as such. You're lucky to find true liberals. You're lucky to find true liberals.
Liberalism. I mean, God, I'd be happy just protecting liberalism on campuses these days, because I think debate and like an honest view of both sides and trying to play devil's advocate in the most honest way possible, that seems to me to be a liberal value, but that's been trampled over completely. I mean, you're seeing it this week is just appalling.
Yeah, the old liberalism was about process, free speech, free discussion, free assembly. But just look at the atmosphere in that Seattle Autonomous Zone, right? Just look at the way that they sort of demand your sort of ID. And what they mean by your ID is your sort of revolutionary commitment to their cause, right?
It's not like they're not doing a background check.
Exactly.
That's not what it's about.
Yeah, so these guys could not care less about constitutional liberties. They have no respect for other people's point of view. They think that intimidation and thuggery is sort of kosher. Yeah. And I think to myself, who created these sort of scumbags? And the short answer is their professors did.
That is. And it's also, I've noted, and this is kind of a lazy, just casual observation, it's not based into deep theory or anything, but we have a lot of movies in America that sort of anticipate this kind of thing, like The Purge, The Joker. Okay. And again, I'm not blaming these movies. I think that would be ridiculous, but like there is this sort of wild side to American pop culture that these people are living out. And I think they've seen it. They live good lives. They can't argue otherwise. If you interviewed each one of them, they're well fed. They probably maybe had some kind of job, or at least moved in between jobs. But they
had to go further. If you were to say to them, all right, let's take some of the kind of accoutrements of modern technological capitalism, like the GPS and Uber and Airbnb and the iPhone. How about if we take those things away? Yep. They would freak out, right? I mean, they can't imagine life without those things.
And it's and this gets to your book. So, and we should just get right. We want to go kind of page by page here. Not page by page. That'll take too long. But you get to that point about what socialism really is and like what they mean by it. Because I bet if you interviewed all the Chaz people, they would probably all identify with socialism of some sort. Now, how they define that is another story. Because like I said, they definitely want their iPhone. Now, maybe they believe that socialism can create iPhones. I don't know. Again, we'd have to ask them. It'd be interesting to see where they're at. Again, when we survey young people, those same young people will also say they don't want government intervention in their lives. So it's almost like these are anarcho-socialists, which kind of just tells you they have no idea what any of it means. They're just mad about something. And again, maybe they've just watched crazy movies and they think that's the way to live. I don't know. I mean, there's so many explanations here. You have a definition of socialism, which I think is important to start with, because there's the definition that is often maybe the classical definition that it's state control over industry, the ownership over the means of production. But that doesn't quite define what we're seeing in America, as you know. And so You use this one, Joseph Schumpeter's definition in his work, Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, defines socialism as a system in which, quote, as a matter of principle, the economic affairs of society belong to the public and not to the private sphere.
Yeah, and if you go back to Marx, he thought of socialism as the workers owning the means of production. So the Ford Motor Company is owned collectively by the workers in that company.
Right.
But for socialism in the 20th century, the kind of socialism I grew up under, they didn't have that. I mean, Indians didn't do that. But what they did is the government took over the airlines, and the government took over the banks, and the government took over the agriculture industry. So nationalization was the defining feature of socialism. That's not what the left wants here. They don't actually want the government to nationalize the computer industry, for example.
Right.
So socialism here has taken on its own peculiar style or hue. And the left today would say, we don't really want the authoritarian socialism of, let's say, Mao or Lenin or Stalin. Ours is democratic socialism. And this is a key idea, because what they're saying is, look, we have a political sphere that's democratic, but we have an economic sphere that's not. So we want to extend the same democracy that we have in the political sphere over the economic sphere.
Right.
We want to put the people in charge of the American economy. And that gives us more legitimacy. The moral legitimacy of democratic capitalism comes from the idea of democracy. So I take this very seriously in the book. I look at it very carefully, and I try to refute it on its own terms. One good principle for me of writing and of debate is it's always easy to attack the other guy on his weakest or stupidest ground.
Right.
So don't do that.
Right.
You can do that in a quip, but then take him on his strongest ground.
Yeah.
Frame his argument in a way that he would frame it. Or
Right.
she would frame it
100%.
and answer it there, So that's the first point, democratic socialism. The second point, of course, is that who says socialism doesn't work? It works in Scandinavia.
Yeah.
It works in Sweden and Norway. That's our model, says the left. Now, I have a whole chapter, that discusses this. A third element, which I go into some depth about, but just want to mention here, because I think it relates to all the things going on around us, from George Floyd to even the Seattle zone, the Rayshard Brooks incident in Atlanta. And that is, our socialism now is, I call it identity socialism, because it's kind of a marriage between socialism and identity politics.
And that is how it's transformed over time. And actually, I want to get into, because you analyze very carefully how that's transitioned over time. First we have to get to some of the ideas that I think they rely on. And this is an interesting point you made, because you talk about AOC in a speech she gave, where she talks about the end of work, how jobs are going away because of automation, and there's just not going to be enough jobs. But she's not worried about this because she's not wrong about automation taking away some jobs, or at least transitioning them. But it worries people like us, and we think, okay, well, what do we do to get our skill sets and reduce the skills gap and get people properly trained for the new workforce? That's how we think about it. She thinks, good. Let there not be jobs. Why are you working in the first place? Why aren't you, I don't know, exploring your art and all these things? And so it's like, and what you note is that capitalism actually led to its own demise, not the way Marx thought it would, but because of its own success. There's so much abundance that a lot of people who do not create a whole lot of things see that abundance and they say, well, I deserve some of that.
This is Schumpeter, straight out. The economist Joseph Schumpeter, he said that capitalism would sow the seeds of its own decay. Precisely for this reason, not only that it produces the abundance, but it produces a sort of generation that takes that for granted. So AOC is a classic example of this, and we can see the distance between, say, AOC and Marx, because for Marx, it was all about the sweaty 15-hour-a-day worker. Marx sympathized with that guy. Marx says that guy's getting shafted.
Right.
At some point, he's going to get so immiserated, impoverished, he's going to want to throw off the burden. That's when we get the socialist revolution. But with AOC, you get the sense that work is actually not important. And in fact, she wants to get rid of it. Yeah. So it's not really workers of the world unite, it's sort of freeloaders of the world unite. Yeah. And she somehow thinks that you can create this abundance with very little work and give everybody a time to sort of explore their identity and do those sorts of AOC type things.
But as you know, also, you got to attack their best arguments, and you do that, and you say the conservatives get this wrong. We're too quick to say, well, it's never worked, or it's just about free stuff. They just want free stuff. They're all ungrateful. They just want free stuff. But that's not exactly the track you take.
No, because now here's an interesting, it's kind of an interesting comparison between the Scandinavians and us on this key point. The Scandinavians never talk about free stuff. And the reason is really simple. They have a big welfare state, but they distribute the burden across the whole society. Yeah. They have, for example, a VAT tax, the value-added tax, 25%.
It's huge, yeah.
Right? And who pays that the most proportionally? The poor. Right. And who pays it second most? The middle class. And who pays it the least proportionally? The rich. Yeah. So it is a regressive tax, as economists call it. And the Scandinavians don't hesitate to impose 50% income taxes on people who make 70 grand. Yeah. So the point of the Scandinavians is that nothing's free. Of course, education isn't free. You need buildings and technology and pay professors. Of course, healthcare isn't free. You need doctors and labs and so on. So the idea here is that you get stuff from the government, but you're the one paying for it. And I think that's a key distinguishing point, because when the Scandinavians do that, they don't demonize the rich. Everybody's in it together. Whereas in this country, if you listen to Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, they're always denouncing millionaires and billionaires. They're always saying, we're going to make that guy pay for it.
Yeah, it's a politics of resentment.
It is. And what's kind of funny with Bernie, of course, is that if you listen to his old rhetoric, it was always millionaires and billionaires. Now you'll notice it's mainly billionaires, right? And we know why.
Yeah. Why do you have multiple houses, Bernie? Because I wrote books. Oh, okay. So that's okay then, right? I mean, to do the work and then to get paid for it. Just to be clear here.
And the book's sold in the free market.
And there's this assumption that all other wealth aside from theirs is ill-begotten wealth. And
Right.
And they hammer that over and over again without evidence.
Oh, AOC is classic. I mean, she says you don't make $1 billion, you take $1 billion, and that summarizes.
She says all the quiet parts out loud.
Well, but in a way, I think that's good because it forces me, I mean, as a writer, it forces me to say, okay, now I need to explain why, the valet at the Trump Hotel in Washington, D.C., who parks a car, and it's $30 to park a car, and he parked 100 cars yesterday. So he took in $3,000, you might say, for the resort.
Right.
But the resort paid him $15 an hour, let's just say for 10 hours. So he only got $150
Right.
out of $3,000. So where did the other money go? Who deserves that? What is it that entrepreneurs really do? I mean, think about Marx was actually very cunning. Marx did not coin the term capitalism, but he popularized it. And it was a very good term for him for a simple reason, because Marx went on to say, and I'm not sure if this was just ignorance or cunning, but he went on to say that the capitalist provides basically just the capital. When there's a business, the capitalist puts up the dough, and he doesn't do anything else.
Yeah.
Now, in reality, nothing could be further from the truth. First of all, most entrepreneurs do not provide the capital. They get it from somewhere else.
Yeah.
Steve
Right.
Jobs went to a venture capital firm, and he went to a bank.
And you have to sell yourself to them.
Exactly.
in order to do that.
You present your idea. So capitalists do other things, but those other things were hidden by Marx by implying that the capitalist is merely the money man.
And they're not. They obviously have talent. They have a vision. They have to have some kind of management skills. And there's just a whole slew of things. And
They take all the risk.
all the risk. And it's like, do they not know this, or do they pretend not to know it?
I think they pretend not to know it because...
Of course they know it.
Yeah, they know it. They know it. And I think they envy it, because I'll give you an example of how I know they know it. Here's a tweet by Ilhan Omar, right? She goes, the CEO of Walmart makes $23 million a year. The ordinary worker at Walmart makes $23,000 a year. Let's think about this for a minute. Let's say that the Marxist idea is true, and the CEO of Walmart does, well, not a lot, right? And the workers of Walmart are the ones who make Walmart go. They're the ones who make it happen. So here's a simple solution. The workers of Walmart all get together and decide to start their own Walmart, except without a CEO. Right? They take that $23 million and split it among themselves. Now, in the history of the world, I'm not aware of a single case where anyone's done this, where the workers go, hey, we don't need the CEO. Let's all quit, start our own company, and do this exact same thing. And since we do all the work, we get to split all the profits.
In theory, it would be easy.
In theory, it would be easy, but in fact, the worker at Walmart knows I'm standing behind a counter, I'm hitting the cash register every day. I don't know how to make Walmart. I don't know how to get this stuff in, whether it's from China or Thailand or India. I don't know how to make all the logistics work. I don't know how to market this. I don't know any of it. I can't do it.
Yeah, you're a cog in the machine. And that's okay. You have a purpose.
That's right.
And like, there is dignity in work.
Of course.
And most regular people understand that. It's when they get this idea sort of, it's like Inception. It's like the movie Inception. That's what Marx says. When he got this idea in everybody's head that you should be resentful, that because you see something better than what you have, you should be highly ungrateful for what you have. And now, if you're in a true struggle, I get that, which kind of gets at the inequality debate. And it's not that we don't care about the poor; it's that I only care about the poor. I do not care that there's really, really rich people. I don't care that just down the street from here there are houses that are so expensive that I'm never going to afford them. I do not live in those places, and that's okay because I'm doing fine. Now, if you're not doing fine, that's something we have to look at. If there's the opportunities not available to you, that's the American dream that's being taken. Let's look at that, but let's not divide our attention with resentment towards the rich, and then, okay, let's focus on the poor as an afterthought, even though they really don't. We should focus 100% on getting people to move up the social ladder.
I mean, we've been, quote, studying poverty since at least the 1930s. And we don't study success. So you look, for example, at some of our dilapidated inner cities. Now, immigrants move into those cities. And I'm not just talking, by the way, about the Asians or something. I'm talking about black immigrants from Nigeria and Trinidad and the West Indies. And they navigate through these places. They make something of themselves. They're able to move out into the suburbs. So how do they do it?
Yeah.
If there's racism, why isn't racism keeping them down? Right. What is their formula? I mean, one of the beauties of living in a multiracial society, you kind of learn from each other. You look over your shoulder.
This is the most diverse city in America, Houston.
Yeah, Houston. Yeah. Well, I mean, going, for a moment, India, the reason India started moving in a capitalist direction is actually not because any of the Indians started reading Adam Smith. Not at all. The Indians basically looked over their shoulder and saw the Chinese. And they said, here's a bunch of guys who used to go down to the beach to wash their clothes, and they lived in little hovels, and now they have nice cars, and they have washing machines, and they're living so much better. Why don't we do what they're doing? Mm-hmm. So it's the strategy of emulation. It's so much better than envy. Instead of trying to pull the other guy down because you hate him, because he's better than you, he runs faster than you, why not try to improve your own performance based upon learning from what he did?
And this is what the founding was about. You write extensively about the Federalist Papers, and the Federalist Papers, of course, basically laid the foundation for the Constitution, how we should govern. Declaration of Independence told us why we govern: to protect our inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It should also be noted, a lot of people don't realize this, but Jefferson didn't write life, liberty, and property in the Declaration. And even though that was the John Lockean phrase that he was pulling from, life, liberty, and property. Why? Because it was an abolitionist document. The Declaration of Independence was an abolitionist document. It was used by the abolitionists. It's held up and said, this is why we can't have slavery. People don't realize that. They didn't want to use the word property because at that time it meant a person. And you can't have that in a founding document. So he said pursuit of happiness. And anyway, side note. But the point is that these basic foundations of a free market economy and property rights and what I like, you write here, you use a quote from Montesquieu. It is fortunate for men to be in a situation in which, though their passions may prompt them to be wicked, they nevertheless have an interest in not doing so. So it's a structure formulated for people to live free and not beat each other over the heads trying to take their stuff.
Yeah, America, I think, is the anti-socialist country, par excellence. And interestingly, Marx and Engels both knew that, and they commented on it. They basically said, we're not sure that the socialist revolution is coming to America. Now, they thought as a law of history it was going everywhere. So they said it'll come to America eventually, but they thought it might take longer. An economist named Werner Sombart wrote a book in the about 100 years ago, Why is there no socialism in America, right? And he said, look at Europe. You've got socialist parties, you've got socialist governments, but there's no socialism in the American mainstream, at least not until now. And Sombart's reason for it is really simple. He goes, well, the reason is that the working man in America has it too good. The American system works for him. So he goes, all socialist utopias come to grief on roast beef and apple pie. And I think the left in America has figured this out, by the way. They've realized, look, I'm not going to get socialism that way. I can't count on the working class. In fact, if I go to the Trump rally, I'll find a bunch of working class guys there.
Right.
Wow.
Right.
So
they lost
those guys.
Class, yeah.
So now they say, well, let's tap other forms of division. The Marxist division, the rich versus the poor, needs to be supplemented by the black against white, by the male against female, by the straight against gay, by the legal against illegal. So I see the left as in a way more divisive than Marx because they're layering on these other forms of division. This is identity socialism. And their goal is to create a kind of majority of oppressed victim groups. That's the strategy.
And it started well before even they got into the identity politics game, which started in the 60s. And you write about that with Herbert Marcuse and how he was the godfather of identity politics in many ways. And they've only, and the progressive left has only expanded upon that to an extraordinary degree. And unfortunately, we continue to see the consequences of that. But it started much earlier than that. And so talk to me about, I'm skipping around here a little bit, but talk to me about Wilson, the godfather of progressivism, what he believed, what he thought of our founding documents, and how he was certainly avowed anti-socialist and yet laid all the groundwork for it.
Yeah, Wilson, there are two things probably worth saying here about him. The first is that he was the first president to attack the founders. This is quite interesting because the founding had been around over 100 years. There had been disputes about the founding. For example, the Civil War was a great argument over the founding. But interestingly, in the Civil War, both sides insisted that they were the true descendants, intellectual descendants of the founders. It took the progressives in the early 20th century to say basically the founders suck.
Yeah.
And Wilson was on board with all this.
Yep.
That's the first thing. And so he was consciously repudiating the founding, consciously moving society toward, in a sense, what he called the idea of a visionary who has a better idea of the future than the founders ever could. So the founders now sort of are antiquated. They represent the past. They represent the agricultural society. Now, this brings me to the second point about Wilson, which is that he thought he was this great sort of seer into the future, right? So while he's president at Princeton, he looks out of his window and he sees a remarkable sight: cars driving on the road. And Wilson's position, as he begins to reflect on this, is the car is basically an obscenity. There should not be cars. Now, he's not saying, it's important to note, he's not saying I, Woodrow Wilson, don't want to drive a car. He's basically saying cars should not exist.
Yeah.
And why should cars not exist? Because he, Woodrow Wilson, sitting in his office at Princeton and twiddling his thumbs, can't think of good reasons to have a car. In fact, he says things like the car is really not much faster than the horse and buggy, which is true. At that time, it wasn't. But then contrast Wilson with Henry Ford, basically a mechanic. And Henry Ford, without Wilson's pretensions to seeing the future or any of that nonsense, basically takes this $3,000 expensive rich man's toy called the automobile, brings the price down to $370, basically revolutionizes the American way of life. So who's the real progressive? I mean, who's the guy who makes the car an instrument of not just of American convenience, but American freedom?
And it's like
Henry Ford 1, Woodrow Wilson 0.
It's like Elon Musk says, we need more people who build things. And you also you compare, you use the history of railroads in this country, the history of shipbuilding in this country, and with Vanderbilt and I forget all the historical names, but you probably have them all memorized because that's what you do. it's
well,
impressive.
I mean, the history
and
is
airplanes as well. And it's like what you talk about though is the government subsidies. Competing with people who are using their own money, and who won, and who actually built America.
Who built America? I mean, this is fascinating also because I find, for me, it's a little bit of intellectual sort of detective work, and I'll tell you why. Woodrow Wilson. I mentioned this thing about the car. Pick up a handful of Woodrow Wilson biographies, it goes unmentioned. Why is that? Because progressives write those books, right? And they come across the fact, oh, wow, our great hero, the first progressive president, was against the automobile. I mean, how dumb is that, right? So let's not make him look like an idiot, but let's leave that conveniently out of our biography, So then Dinesh has to ferret it out, and I go, yeah, here we go, It's kind of part of the fun of it, right?
And that wasn't it, though. I mean, Wilson stood for a bunch of horrible things. Yeah, he wanted to rewrite the Constitution. He didn't like checks and balances. Was he against the Electoral College as well? I mean, it seems that progressives have long been for a mob democracy. They want that 51% coalition, as you.
He was pushing in that direction for sure. I mean, and the other thing about it, very interesting now in the era of knocking down statues. I mean, Woodrow Wilson, FDR, and LBJ. All were in different ways notorious racists. People
it's
don't
well known. It's not a.
It's well known. I mean, with Woodrow Wilson, for example, people don't realize the federal government was not segregated in the 19th century. There was segregation in the South, but Woodrow Wilson extended that segregation. He basically took the Southern model and introduced it to the federal government. So federal departments began to be segregated inside the department itself.
Really?
Yeah. And Wilson, of course, revived the Ku Klux Klan, which had been shut down by the Republican Party in the 1870s, but was revived by Wilson by showing the movie Birth of a Nation in his in the White House. He created a Klan revival even in states where there wasn't a Klan before.
It just shows the hypocrisy of the left right now. As last night in Portland, a statue of George Washington was torn down. And we always knew this was going to happen. This was the end result. Like, if you want to have a good debate about Confederate statues, I think that's a perfectly reasonable debate, to be honest. About just because of the way they're highlighted, why they were built. Those questions should be asked. But we always knew you were going to go for George Washington. We always knew that was the end goal.
And Columbus and Churchill and Lincoln. That's the key.
And this gets into just a vast ignorance of history as well, but it's more than that. It's about undermining the very story of America. because that's always what it's been about. If you're going to argue to revolutionize society, to make people, you have to make people believe that they live in an evil society. You have to make people believe that there is a lot of stolen wealth and they stole it from you. Even though, don't believe your lying eyes, right? Don't believe all the nice stuff you have. Like, don't look too far in the past and think about how much worse off your grandparents and great grandparents were. And don't think about that. It's all a lie. It's the capitalist lie. And so that kind of rewriting of history starts to occur, and with Howard Zinn and with Marcuse, and you talk about that as well. I know I'm jumping around here because I'm trying to get us to. Your book does a good job of like examining how this happened in America, and I want listeners to understand it.
The attack on America is always combined with a camouflage of the Democratic Party. In fact, you could almost say that the attack on America is intended to transfer the crimes of the Democrats onto America in general. I mean, here's a little telling example. Right now, pretty much as we speak, they're talking about trying to pull down this Abraham Lincoln statue in Boston. Okay. Now move over to Chicago, where in Chicago there is right now, unguarded and untouched, a huge statue to Stephen Douglas. Stephen Douglas was Abraham Lincoln's main rival, Democrat, Northern Democrat, champion of slavery. Right? Now, ask yourself this question. Are these Antifa people just merely dumb? Are they accidentally targeting Lincoln? No. The reason they don't want to target Stephen Douglas is that Stephen Douglas was a Northern Democrat. So it exposes the fact that the Democrats were the party of slavery in the North as well as in the South. The left wants the Civil War to be North-South so they can hide the crimes of the Democratic Party. And the reason they hate Lincoln is that Lincoln was on to them. I mean, basically what Lincoln said about slavery was this. Slavery is you work and I eat, right? So slavery is a form of theft. Slavery is economic confiscation because what is being stolen? The slave's labor. He doesn't get to keep the fruit of his labor. And then Lincoln points the finger and goes, this is the credo of the Democratic Party, right? Now, there's a whole bunch of progressives today who will tell you, well, Abraham Lincoln was really a progressive. He was really on our side, you know. But if you fast forward from Lincoln's day to now and ask yourself this question, what is the credo of the Democratic Party today? Answer: economic confiscation. You work, I eat. So
they've switched.
The application is a little different,
but group identity politics, but they've always been identity politicians.
The principle is exactly the same.
It just shifted from white supremacy to like whatever. I mean, this kind of strange coalition of group on group politics, and but it's never been for equality. That's the thing. It's shifted in balance in who you discriminate against, but it's never been for equality. Republicans, I think, have always been very consistent with Lincoln's principles of equality, equal application of the law in a Republican system. Because what you talk about is he used the Republican system of governance against mob politics to argue against slavery. He said just because 51% of the population in your state thinks that the other 49% should be enslaved to them does not make that okay. That goes against our constitutional principles, our Republican principles. And it's important to understand the Republican, and I explain this to people sometimes because they're like, well, what's the difference between Democrat and Republican? And I say, well, there's a lot of ways to think about it. Political, cultural, economic differences. I think those are the good three lines of three pillars to differentiate. On the political side, it's really simple. Republicans stand for a republic. Democrats stand for a mob democracy. Pure democracy versus a republic. Our founders were very well educated on the dangers of a mob democracy, but Democrats have long been trying to get that back, right? And and you talk about this, you get into what they mean by democratic socialism. It's the will of the people, but the will of the people is 50% plus one.
Yeah, it's very important to zoom in on this and help understand this clearly. So think of it this way. When I was a kid, I'd go to my school and I would have in my pocket a bunch of marbles, you know? So imagine if I did that. And
did you really walk to school with a bunch of marbles?
Yeah, I actually did.
What are you doing with these marbles?
Well, in recess, we would basically all start playing.
It's a game.
Yeah, it's a game, of course. Yeah, so I had these marbles in my pocket, treasured them. They were kind of my possession. So anyway, imagine if I got to school and some big guy jumps me, beats me up, and takes my marbles, right? So that's like authoritarian socialism. A dictator of some sort grabs my stuff without my consent. But now consider a second example. I find myself among a group of like 10 kids. They take a vote. and 6 of them, by majority rule, decides, let's jump Dinesh and take his marbles.
Yeah.
Right?
That's democratic.
Right. That's democratic. And it's authorized by the majority. But what's the difference from my point of view? Either way, I'm being robbed. I mean, to me, it's sort of like either am I going to be robbed by one guy or is this a gang robbery? But one way or the other, I'm being ripped off.
You are. And it's some arguments go that socialism works in very small groups. There may be some indication that can be true. Look at a co-op or something. But if it is pure majority rule, you still need inalienable rights. You still need rights that are protected that cannot be changed. And this is something that is so unique in America, and we should feel very lucky. As long as we can actually protect them sufficiently. But this gets to why America works and what a republic really is. This sort of constitutional framework where these rights can't change. A majority can't change these rights. It has to be practically unanimous to change the Constitution. And that would protect your marbles.
That's absolutely right. The forms of socialism that work best, if they work at all, well, I mean, look at the early Christians. They were a kind of socialist commune. But here's the key point. It was a voluntary commune. People come together, they're like-minded, and they have all things in common, according to the book of Acts. The earliest socialist communities were like that. In England and in France, there were communities of people. These were more the free love type communities, but nevertheless, they put all their stuff together. They shared everything, but you were free to join and you were free to leave.
Yeah.
So that's the key point. Now, Marx comes along and he basically goes, you guys are dreamers and idiots. This is not a formula for society. So according to Marx, he introduced this notion of division. Society basically is all about a struggle. And his point was that powerful people never give it up without a struggle. They have to be overthrown violently if necessary. And so socialism took on its divisive taint, right starting with Marx, and it's never let it go.
Something I was thinking about as we were talking was the question is, why do they keep pushing for this? Is it if it so clearly doesn't work, and if we're trying to analyze their motivations, and we're like, they know it doesn't work, but they don't care, then why the hell are they doing it? It's a combination of power and utopian thinking?
Yeah, I'd like to try to answer that question. I think, and it is, quite common for conservatives to say it doesn't work, but it depends what you mean by work. I'll give you a small example. Years ago when I was in D.C., I heard someone talk about the public school system, and she offhandedly made the comment, who says it doesn't work? Lots of people work here. Right? And in other words, from her point of view, it wasn't about education at all. Of course, it didn't work from that angle. But from the point of view of creating mass employment, it was a big success, right? So the way the socialists think about it, I think, is like this. You can think of the socialists as divided into a sort of recipient class or dependent class, and then a leadership class. Now, the leadership class is not lazy. They're extremely industrious, and they get a lot out of it. What do they get out of it? Well, they get a lot of power, but they also get money. I mean, in America, it's really interesting to me how Democrats who have basically held government office for most, if not all of their lives, become centimillionaires. The Clintons have gone from $0 to $200 million. Al Gore has got $100 million. The Bidens. Now,
I'm really trying to figure that out.
Right.
Because I am a politician. There's a lot of rules. I can't make
There's a lot of rules. Well, let's look for a moment at Biden, okay? Because if Biden's, in a way, today he's sort of rocking chair Biden. He doesn't know what's going on. But Biden, for most of his career, has been extremely crafty. If you look at Biden's net worth over the decades, it's about the same. It never rises. You have to go to Hunter Biden and James Biden and Frank Biden, the other brother, to notice that their net worths are rising into gargantuan levels. So what's really going on is Biden kind of shows up in a country. The people of that country, by the way, they've been doing this for centuries. They know that the way you get favorable deals is you treat very well the family members of influential people. And so they lavish contracts on the Biden family.
Right.
No disclosure requirements, as you know, about those things. And so now, again, the left says we're trying to follow the model of Scandinavia. Name for me one Scandinavian politician who has gone from 0 to 100 million euros on a government salary. It does not exist.
Yeah.
But in Venezuela, socialism is a racket. The Chavez family is the richest family in the country. So in reality, when you look at the parallels, we're following far more the Venezuelan model than we are the Scandinavian model.
Yeah, that's true. Because the other, going back to something, it's depending on what you mean by works, and this is an important kind of debate point that they like to use, which is, they'll point to a fire department and they'll point to a school system, a public education system. They'll point to public goods and they'll say, look, it's socialism. So why can't those public goods be transferred to healthcare and housing and whatever else is next on their list? And it becomes a complicated discussion, and you try to tease out whether that's socialism or simply a public good that we all agree on. And I got into this debate about how a fire department is different from healthcare system with Joe Rogan. And this is a common question asked, and I think it's by a lot of regular people. And it's an earnest question that is asked. They're not trying to trick anybody. It's an honest question. They don't see the difference. And so how do you tend to answer that?
I'd answer it by saying, look, let's go back to the very kind of, one way to think about this, the early modern philosophers were very good about it. They basically said, look, let's think of human beings in a state of nature. Right, we're all on our own. We're running through the forest. Now, why would we want to create a society? What's in it for us? What's the point of doing that? They go, well, the first reason, the overwhelming reason, and maybe even the only reason to do it is for safety. In other words, you enter a society because you want protection from foreign and domestic thugs. You want protection from people outside your society who will raid your society and rob you and kill you, or you want protection from other members in the society itself. So the idea of cops and fires, this basic notion of protecting yourself, your body, your family, your security, and your possessions, that's the reason you do it at all. So all those things, in a sense, you could call them tier one. Yep. They're the absolute, that's why I think it's so amazing that the left is like defund the police. Now, if they say defund the police, and they don't mean it seriously, but let's say they did, I think they have a different agenda, which we can get to.
But they did do it, like in multiple cities.
They did do it, but I think their goal is a little bit different. Their goal is to do to the police what they did to the Boy Scouts. They want to bring the Boy Scouts to their knees so they can turn the Boy Scouts into an instrument of their indoctrination. They want a politically correct police force that will let them be above the law, but not us. Yeah. But let's just take this defund the police. Let's say they were absolutely dead serious, and our country then had no police. Yep. Right? I would say if that's the case, that's like having no military, and that basically means that the social contract is dissolved. Because even Hobbes, the great defender of Leviathan, the big state, Hobbes basically goes, you turn to the Leviathan state to protect your property and your person and your security, and if the government doesn't do that, you're out. You're not part of the social. You don't owe them taxes. You don't owe them any obligations. You have every revolutionary right to overthrow the government because they have broken their side of the bargain. So the radicalism of this and the willingness of the left, even rhetorically, to go there shows you that when they say things like the government won't protect you, but it's going to offer you this excellent healthcare program, they don't realize the kind of nonsense they're talking about, because a healthcare program is optional, but protecting my body and my family and my security is absolutely critical.
And it's a philosophical discussion about the role of government and negative rights versus positive rights. And if you're telling somebody that they have to give you healthcare, that's a positive right, because you're demanding the conscription of somebody else's services in favor of you, and you apparently have a right to that, even if maybe their shift's over. It doesn't matter that you have a right to demand it from them, or you wait 6 weeks, which is more likely what happens, just like it does in Canada. And the other argument I have to point out about the fire station versus the hospital is that healthcare is such a long series of actual services. It's not as simple as put out a single fire. So put the philosophy aside, on a very practical level, it's much easier to implement a public good that does one thing, that puts out fires for this one service, and it should also be known that you're not competing with each other to use that service unless you all deliberately set your house on fire.
You could have a healthcare program that is like the fire department, which would be this, catastrophic healthcare. So let's think about this for a moment. It's not that Americans can't afford healthcare. The reason healthcare is expensive is because other people pay, and so the prices are inflated. If you didn't have that, if the consumer was paying and you went to see the doctor, it's more likely to be $40 than $300 because you're paying. Right. So you'd be watching it. Now, can people afford to pay $40? Most people can. Right? Now, what people can't afford to do is pay for a lifelong illness or a catastrophic, I need, a quadruple bypass. So those are catastrophic situations, but those are relatively rare. So the government can ensure that, which would be protecting you against
Right.
catastrophic reversals. You don't want to have to give up your house or lose your entire savings. And that would cost a fraction of Obamacare.
Yeah.
But the left knows that, and they don't want to do that because they like the dependency created by mass entitlement. So if they want to use a fire department, the fire department is a catastrophic event. How likely is it for your house to get caught on fire?
Yeah.
And you want to insure against that. The equivalent of that would be a catastrophic healthcare program, which this country can afford,
Yeah. It's
but
like
which we never even seriously debated.
Yeah, and we should. It's basically a reinsurance program is what would be a kind of a good way to a conservative idea towards that. And I don't want to get too much into because I love talking healthcare, so I don't want to go too much on that tangent. I want to stick to your book. Well, I lost track.
Well,
of
let
my
me pick it
thought
up,
here.
if I may, with one point, and that is, people often say things like when they're thinking about these goods, and you're robbing Peter to pay Paul. What you were talking about when your right costs somebody else some money, right? They'll say things like, well, that there's. Your possessions are somehow not part of you. So in other words, economic rights aren't so important. Civil rights are critical because, and you'll even see this when people talk about violence. I saw somebody the other day on CNN, they're saying, well, it's only property. So pulling down a building or defacing a monument and so on, this is sort of harmless kind of activity. And the idea here is that your property is somehow external to you, whereas let's just say your First Amendment right to speak is somehow who you really are. Now, I want to dispute this, and I dispute it at the philosophical level, because I say to myself that when I think of my possessions, and I mean my collection of books, I mean the clothes I wear, I mean the brand of glasses and my watch, my possessions are an extension of me. They are as much a part of me as my memories. They're as much a part of me as my relationships. They're as much a part of me as any other part of me. So in other words, if you take away those basic things that define in part who I am, you may as well be stealing coercively taking away my views or coercively taking away my memories. I think that this notion of property as part of us is something very fundamental and gets completely lost in this debate.
Yeah, it certainly does, and it's a culture war fundamentally, and so we're going to get back to your book now because I like all the tangents. They're good, but it's important. I think it is so important to talk about how we got to this point, and it is fundamentally about telling a different story about America. You talk about the progression of Frederick Douglass, and I write about Frederick Douglass as well in my book, and because his story starts out saying, "Listen, this he hates the flag, right? He hates the national anthem. He hates all of it because it doesn't represent him. He's a runaway slave, But then he comes to terms with it. Then in his later writings, he starts to say, why aren't we included in the founding documents? You read these founding documents, and he calls them, he says, these glorious liberty documents that we have to live up to. And so, but talk about that for a second. And why did you put him in the book there?
He represents, I believe that Frederick Douglass is the one guy whose monuments the left would love to tear down, but they don't dare to. In part because he's the greatest African American. He's the greatest Black American of our history. It's not even close. So they don't dare to take on Douglass, but they don't like Douglass. They don't like his teachings, because his core doctrine, articulated in his standard speech that he gave thousands of times in abolitionist meetings and elsewhere, was called the self-made man. Mm-hmm. And Douglass basically says that America is the country of the self-made man. This resonates with me. I mean, when I came to America, I looked around and I said, wow, what I find remarkable is, first of all, I noticed how well off the ordinary guy has it in America. And I'm like, this is cool. Even if a guy is kind of not that smart and kind of lazy, I noticed that he has 2 cars, central air. He's living pretty well. So that's the prosperity of it. But what Douglass emphasized was the fact that you can make your own life. You kind of chart the course of your own destiny in this country, which is very true. And Douglass believed that the government should stay out of that. He gave a famous speech where he goes, essentially, what should the government do for the black man? And his answer, kind of shocking Nothing. And he's writing right after the Civil War when you've got all these slaves who have not been resettled in the country. But Douglass takes the hard line. Do nothing for us. He goes, leave us alone. You've done enough, And this kind of stuff is like the stuff that makes professors have nightmares. This is the stuff they hate to teach.
Yeah.
So they suppress it. I mean, they ruthlessly suppress it. And they instead, emphasize other figures who are kind of more congenial to the socialist ideology. So Douglass is a kind of standing monument against the socialist impulse. That's why I put him in. And you can contrast Douglass, who was an industrious, hardworking guy, with a guy like Bernie Sanders.
And the reason I talk about him is because of how he talks about true victims, but still, because when you're a victim, and he was, a real one, not a perceived one. There are perceived injustices and there are real injustices, and you can have a rational discussion between the two. But he clearly had injustices leveled against him, and he didn't say, this makes the whole country bad, we should tear it all up. He said, we should live up to the ideals that we were founded on. Like I said before, Declaration of Independence was used by abolitionists just a couple years after it was written to make their case, because it was written carefully. And it was meant to abolish slavery. They knew they couldn't abolish it in that time. But for a young country, we abolished it in the Civil War. And he understood that, and that's why he held up those glorious liberty documents, as he called them, and said, we should live within this story. If we're going to tell ourselves this story, let's live up to it. And I think that's just highly relevant to right now, and it's relevant to the socialists' general story of America. Again, the Howard Zinn history. America is bad. It is this cancer on the world, and we must tear it down. These symbols that supposedly unify us must be torn down and remade into something else. Again, you have to hate your country if you're going to want to revolutionize it.
Yeah, and I think the ideology also tends to sort of dehumanize. And the remarkable thing about Douglass that I find so profound is he didn't even dehumanize his owner. Think about this. He was owned by a guy named Hugh Auld, who was, by the way, not that much older than he was. And over the years, Douglass obviously hated him, and he would make all these speeches denouncing him, right? And then toward the end of his life, when Hugh Auld was dying, Douglass goes to see him, right? And Hugh Auld basically, now Douglass is famous. He's the big guy, and Hugh Auld is this kind of lousy guy who's now like on his deathbed, former slave owner. But Hugh Auld says something. He says, Douglass, he says something like, a lot of the things you've said about me, he goes, are false. He tells Douglass, he goes, I didn't do those things to you, and you've made me into this evil guy, and he goes, and I actually tried to treat you well. And then Douglass says something I think very poignant. He goes, it's true. He goes, I didn't run away from you. I ran away from slavery. So here's a case, I think incredible in American history, where a slave is offering a kind of gesture of humanity to his owner. And he's saying, basically, you too were part of the slave system. You didn't have, in a sense, much more choice over it than I did, And so, but the system is evil. Slavery is evil. I ran away from that. I mean, my point is, this is the kind of stuff that movies are made of, but you couldn't make a movie like this because, Black Lives Matter and all this nonsense. And so the human side of history is being crushed by this sort of ideological approach that doesn't allow to see these people like human beings. Robert E. Lee, not in favor of slavery, but very much a Virginian, more a Virginian in the sense that he was an American. And so at the end of the day, even though Lincoln offers him the supreme command of the Union Army, he goes, goodbye, I got to go back to Virginia. I got to fight for Virginia. Wow.
You know what else? And just going back to history of how we got to where we're at. FDR's New Deal. You pointed out some interesting things. I mean, like you said, FDR, Wilson, LBJ, they all have their history of deep-seated racism, talking about the New Deal and Social Security, but how it wouldn't apply to certain workers that were mostly black.
Right.
So,
farm labor and domestic service are exempt.
Right. And so there is obviously justification to the current calls of past historic racism, and that is a definition of systemic racism. If we're going to define the word systemic, that is it, because it's embedded within the system. I don't know how else to define systemic. These days, that's simply not true. But I'm willing to hear this notion that there's still entrails of that, right? But it started with Democrats. It's an internal Democrat debate because it started with FDR. And I wonder if AOC will change the Green New Deal. I didn't also know that you put this in your book. I mean, FDR knowingly put a previous Ku Klux Klan member on the Supreme Court.
Yeah, Hugo Black. And later when it came out that Black had been the lawyer for the Klan nationally. He had been in Klan rallies, he had spoken, he was a very prominent figure in the Klan. But FDR, when it became a scandal, it was reported, I believe, in a Pittsburgh paper, all the deep ties to the Klan. FDR pretended like he never knew. He was like, what? And of course, Black was already on the court, so there wasn't a whole lot you could do about it then. But later, Black in his memoir goes, FDR knew, we discussed it. In fact, he quotes FDR. FDR tells Black, listen, I got no problems with the Klan. Some of my best friends are in the Klan. Again, pick up an FDR biography, Robert Dallek's like 600-page biography, thumb through this, all this stuff. If it's mentioned at all, it's either in the footnotes or it's left out altogether. So there's a great kind of whitewash, if I can use that term, going on. Essentially, all the major progressive figures are sanitized in history. If you go on Wikipedia, you don't find this stuff about them. Students aren't taught about them. Mm-hmm. That's why when I write stuff, people say things like, oh, Dinesh, how can you say that the fascists were left-wing? It says on Wikipedia right here, or it says on NPR, or it says on the History Channel, and I'm like, yeah, but all of those sources are the product of progressive historiography. You're showing me the same bullet bouncing off 6 different walls, and you think you're getting corroboration from these 6 sources when it's the same damn source that's lying through its teeth and then ricocheting from one place to the other and coming at you from different directions.
I always love that when there's like a seething op-ed written and it's like, there's tons of hyperlinks in it, and then you start to go through the hyperlinks and it's just another op-ed chained to another op-ed chained to a tweet from some random, it's like this isn't referencing.
Right. So
it's crazy.
But I mean, we need to track this process. This is how it happens. So a professor writes a book, Nazism was really right-wing. And first of all, the reason is going to be something unbelievably fishy. Like, Nazism involved a lot of militarism, and since we know militarism is right-wing, therefore Nazism is right. So some fundamentally bogus argument. But all his colleagues, also on the left, go, brilliant insights, remakes the debate and so on. Then there's a favorable review in the New York Review of Books. Then, NPR does a big segment. Then the History Channel comes in. Then Michael Moore comes rolling in to make a documentary. So pretty soon this idiocy becomes conventional wisdom. And people think, oh, wow, yeah, it's got to be true. There it's in Barnes & Noble. My professor told me, I saw it on Wikipedia. So we're dealing with the situation. So people talk about fake news. I'm more concerned with these fake narratives and the way they're constructed and the way that they persist. And people indignantly will turn to me and say things like, Dinesh, you don't know any history. When everything that they say I've already thought of. And there's all kinds of stuff I can tell them that they've never heard of because their professors have kept it from them.
Yeah, it's extremely frustrating. I mean, this gets to your other work about Nazi history and what it really is. I mean, most people calling a bunch of right-wingers Nazis don't understand that Nazi is an acronym that has the word socialism as it. And what is it? The National Workers' Party of
the National Socialist German Workers' Party, and Mussolini was a socialist. And the point is, they say, well, it's not just about the name, Dinesh. Well, I'm not saying it's about the name. What I am saying is that the fascists in every major country, there were fascists in England, led by a guy named Mosley. There were fascists in France. So who was the head of fascism in France? Well, it was a guy, Jean Alleman, an old man of the left. He goes back to the Dreyfus case. In Belgium, in Germany, in Italy, you look at all the fascists and you track their histories. Every single one of them was a man of the left. There is no exception to this. So fascism was a phenomenon of the far left. End of story. And so how the left can, the chutzpah of suppressing this, and not only suppressing it, but moving it over into the right-wing column. I mean, this is an act of intellectual hijacking that from a distance I can only admire for its sheer audaciousness.
It's always been very impressive. I mean, you look at Nazi policies just on a policy level, and they match up quite nicely to Bernie Sanders' set of policies. They really are just typical progressive socialist policies.
Yeah, take out a little raving and ranting about the Jews, and you'll basically get this: state control of the banks, state control of education, state control of healthcare, state control of the churches. And down the list you go and you realize, wait a minute, does Donald Trump stand for this? Do the Republicans stand for this? No, but the left does.
We literally have nothing in common with any of it. Like it's it's hyper dishonest.
Now, one of the cunning things the left does is and this is sort of, I call it the argumentum ad ignorantium, because it works on the ignorant. It's the argument for the benefit of the ignorant, right? They'll say things like, well, isn't it true that Hitler fought against the Marxists? Yes, that is true, but here's why. This was an argument inside of the socialist camp.
Yeah.
The Marxists were international socialists, and they took their orders from Moscow. The Nazis were national socialists who believed that the most important thing was socialism in Germany. Their fights were over that. It's kind of like the Shia and the Sunni are fighting.
Yeah, it's like it's a geopolitical struggle. It's not this big ideological struggle.
Well, they're inside the house of socialism in the same way that the Shia and the Sunni are inside the house of Islam.
There's one thing that you note is that, again, you note how conservatives get it wrong sometimes with the way we critique it, and we say that socialism can't work because it's utopian. It goes against human nature. It sort of eliminates this need for incentive. AOC, when she talks about no more people need to work, she's assuming something very silly, which is that you're actually going to get a group of hyper-productive individuals to want to do all this work just so you can take their stuff and redistribute it to everybody else. And you think they're just so pragmatic, that they're just so philanthropic that they're just going to do that. I don't believe that's true. I think that you need some kind of incentive. You need to keep the stuff that you earn. And so there's a utopianism there, and it goes against human nature. But you don't quite agree with that critique.
Well, I mean, is there anything against human nature about not wanting to work? I mean, think of the guy. Think of the guy who's been sitting on his couch now for 3 months, right? Yeah. And AOC says to that guy, "Hey, why get off the couch at all? I mean, who wants to go to work, shave, put on a clean shirt, punch a time clock, listen to your boss rant and rave? How about if we give you $2,000 a month and you can sit on your couch indefinitely, right? Obviously, there's a part of human nature that goes, well, yeah, sounds pretty good, So the socialists are very cunning in appealing to a certain human slothfulness, if you will, that would rather take something for free.
Yeah,
that's not against human nature.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think because I've made that same critique, and I guess what I'm making and I guess so. There's two separate audiences for that. One is like the intellectual audience, but like you say, that critique doesn't work for the people who are like, no, but I like money. I mean, we're seeing this problem right now play out in America, where unemployment insurance is too high for people to go back to work. It's devastating a lot of small businesses around here because they can't get their employees to make that irrational decision, because it is an irrational decision. So that's true. And I guess we're making an intellectual argument to planners of society, because we say people will do exactly what they're doing right now, which is stay at home and not produce things. And it doesn't work because we can't make more wealth as a society for you to redistribute in the first place. That's why it doesn't work.
Yeah, people like AOC, I think what they think, if you press them, is they would say, look, you've got these guys who gain these gargantuan rewards, all this inequality in our society. So there's no reason to believe that they wouldn't work if we took a lot more of their stuff, but not all of it. So let's say, for example, you have a guy who's a billionaire, right? And it's one thing for him, let's just say his tax rate is 37% right now. Well, let's say it was 60. He's still making 40 cents on the dollar, and since he has a lot of dollars, the idea would be he's going to keep doing what he's doing.
Right.
So we can still rip him off without him stopping doing what he's doing. And that thing, AOC assumes that to be true. She doesn't realize, by the way, that these are somewhat abnormal times, similar to the Gilded Age, by the way, which the progressives, again, have sort of, vilified, the Gilded Age. But the Gilded Age gave us the telephone, it gave us the telegraph, it gave us the car, it gave us the airplane, So now when you have these revolutionary kind of innovations, they come with inequality. And the inequality is not created by the entrepreneur. It's created by us. Why? Because think about it. Apple introduces a new product, massive long lines outside the store. The product was not even demanded in the conventional sense, right? Nobody wrote Steve Jobs and said, listen, why don't you make a phone that takes photos, allows texting? I mean, this is a case where Steve Jobs envisions the demand before it exists. He creates the demand for his product, and he makes the phone before people know they can't live without it. So then people are so happy with this, or so happy to cough up $200 or $300 for the phone, that it is the enthusiasm of the consumer body that creates this inequality. So, society doesn't create it. We do as consumers. The market is direct democracy. It reflects us all parting with our hard-earned dollars in exchange for products that we like. So it's kind of weird when these socialists tell me things like, Dinesh, we've got to extend democracy from the political sphere to the economic sphere, because I'm like, we already have it. In fact, we have more democracy in the market than we do in politics. I mean, people vote for you every 2 years, right? They vote for the president every 4 years, but that's all they do. Whereas in the market, we vote every day and many times a day.
Right. And you can, with your pocketbook,
With your pocketbook.
with what you buy, and a company lives or dies by that vote, effectively.
Which is why it has to be responsive to your wants. That's why, for example, I think if we just had the post office, right, and no UPS and no FedEx, I don't think that to this day they would have thought of overnight mail.
Do you think the notion of inequality, because it is, if you ask, and like I agree with you, you have to confront the ideas that they stand for, not their worst ideas, because that's easy. It's easy to build straw man arguments and slash them down. But and so I think I'm being intellectually honest when I say what progressives stand for in principle, and then what they'll say. They stand against injustice and they stand against inequality. This is why they ran for office. It's usually some form of those two things. The problem with that is these aren't limiting principles, and these aren't philosophies of governance. These are just goals, and not only that, but they're goals that are constantly redefined, especially the word injustice. I mean, it's like they don't mean the actual definition of justice. But focusing on inequality, the main problem with that one is, well, they never define when is inequality solved, and like what is the standard they're actually trying to achieve? Is it pure equity? Do they really believe in that? Do they just not like the fact that billionaires keep getting richer? Like what is it they don't like? And I don't know if I have a question there. I'm sort of just exploring it.
I have a theory. I mean, I don't think they're not trying to get rid of inequality. I think what it is at the core that America's a society that is built on the entrepreneur, and it assigns to the entrepreneur the greatest rewards of the society. So you might have, just to compare, for example, a professor of, let's say, Romance languages at Bowdoin College, and some guy living in that town in Maine who sells term life insurance, right? So this is how the professor thinks. He thinks, man, I'm the smartest guy in town. I've got the most degrees. I've spent a lot of time studying. And I actually have a pretty good life. I make, $70,000 or $80,000. I drive a secondhand BMW. I've got a nice house. But look at this bastard. He's an uneducated man compared to me. He's selling term life insurance. He's pulling in $1.4 million a year. Something must be wrong with society which allocates rewards in this fashion. In other words, what the professor thinks is that he is the guy who should be in the driver's seat. He should be running the show. So you can see how progressivism, this notion of the planner, appeals to that mentality. Yeah. And when you look at the progressives who have made a lot of money in politics, guys like Obama, ask yourself this question. I mean,
what did they build?
Exactly. Could Obama start a business? Could he make an iPhone? Could he run Walmart? No. Half of these guys are useless in that, but they're not untalented. Their talents simply lie in other areas.
Yeah, this sort of ruling class of academics, and I remember you talk about that, and they are very wily. They're very clever as they promote themselves as sort of the defenders of social justice, and they sort of get their coalition that way. And this gets back to the basic conversation. This is about coalition building. This is about power seeking, and in order to build that coalition, you got to have 51%. Okay, now, our Constitution says, no, you need more than 51%. And also there's things called states' rights, and there's self-governance at the local level. There's actually a lot of problems with your sort of 51% mentality. Progressives say, that's a good point. Okay, so then you go back to Woodrow Wilson, and they're like, hey, how do we get rid of this whole Constitution thing? Okay, well, that's what. Why did he not like the founders? Because he didn't like the checks and balances. He didn't like how hard it was to push forward with his agenda. That's why he didn't like the founders. So you chip away at it just a little bit. FDR chips away at it some more, showing, hey, look, we can buy people's votes with Social Security. We'll tell them that it's really just a retirement plan that you're putting your own money into and you watch it grow. That's not really true. Turns out it's just one generation paying the next generation, which means it's eventually completely unsustainable, and we're all going to deal with that in the next decade. But it's the Ponzi scheme that you describe. Add to that LBJ's Great Society. Again, what are we really doing? Buying off votes. Now, that's not to say that there's not a reasonable conversation to be had about a social safety net. I think that is perfectly reasonable, but it's chipping away at this idea, right? It's
Yeah. I think one theme worth highlighting with FDR is FDR discovered in the Depression the political opportunities posed by the politics of fear. In other words, FDR realized I can do things in this atmosphere of fear that I would never have been able to do otherwise. And FDR himself pushed that, at least intellectually, to the limit. At one point, he proposed the 100% tax rate.
Yeah.
Basically to make money and turn it all into us. And for a sane man to say this, and again, read FDR biographies. This is really kind of downplayed because its idiocy is too manifest.
Yeah.
But since then, the left, I think, has never given up on that. So I came to America in the 70s. Everyone was talking about the limits to growth, how the country and the world were running out of food. Then in the 80s, it was nuclear apocalypse. Then in the 90s, the ozone layer was apparently dissipating. Mysteriously, it now ceased to dissipate. And now coronavirus. But I mean, it's all the same thing. Basically, the idea is this. Let's create a crowd stampede mentality. So people are living in a sort of state of frozen terror. And then let's hit them with a bunch of policy proposals and say, if you have to do this,
right,
or the human race is going extinct right now.
Yeah.
So you get people to do things that if they actually were in a calm, deliberative frame of mind, they would never do.
Right. And again, don't want you to believe your lying eyes. You have to see these injustices. You have to. You've never experienced them, but you must see them. And you have to make people believe that their current state is evil and that they have it really bad. And that if they can just build their coalition of 51%, then you can overtake it. Again, this gets to the whole difference of democracy versus a republic. And democratic socialists need to dismantle the ideas of a republic if they're ever going to be successful. So moving away from the identity part of socialism and going back to socialism for a second and current socialists, how have they redefined rights?
I don't think in the socialist lexicon there is really any concept of a right in the classic sense, because in the classic sense, a right is a limitation on the government, right? Think of the Bill of Rights. Congress shall make no law is kind of the classic formulation.
Right.
Congress can't do this and Congress can't do that. So you have a right.
It's a negative right.
Yeah, by limiting the power of the government.
Do not infringe on my life, liberty, and property.
Correct. So for socialism, what they call rights, ultimately I would call it is a theft claim. In other words, a right is something like this. I am entitled and will be empowered by this coercive agency called the government to put my hand into your pocket to pay for my stuff. That's what they call a right. It's ultimately a legalized form of theft, in my opinion. Again, I'm not disputing the safety net. I'm not disputing any of that, but I'm disputing the systematic principle that I have a right to the fruit of your labor.
Right.
Again,
it goes back to the hospital versus the fire engine. The Constitution and even the Declaration even guarantees a general sense of safety, hence a fire station and a police force, but it doesn't guarantee you services. Again, so that's negative versus positive.
You don't have a claim
rights
on somebody else's earnings. I mean, as Lincoln puts it, the hand that makes the corn has the right to put the corn into its own mouth. Period. Now what I find, the reason people go for this kind of stuff, I think, is because of the whole furniture of misleading rhetoric that goes around. So you listen to Elizabeth Warren, she'll say things like, the people need to be in charge of the healthcare system. It's been run by the companies and the insurance companies for too long. Let's give it back to the people. Now, think about this for a second, Dan, which is, what role do the people, i.e. you and me or anyone else, have over any public institution? Like, what role do I have over the post office?
Yeah. How is that going to work?
Right.
Yeah.
What control do I have over the DMV?
You're going to let me edit your, the company vision statement every once in a while?
I mean,
what
role does the ordinary British guy have right now over the British National Health Service? None.
Right.
So this whole kind of squid-like cloud of rhetoric is intended to bamboozle people into thinking, whereas what they really mean is the power goes to de Blasio, the power goes to Elizabeth Warren. They are the ones who are going to be running things, not the insurance companies.
The academic elite, not the creators. They again, this goes, and I like the way you framed this sort of ruling class academic elite, the people who don't really create things. It's them versus the creators, and they despise the creators. and it's easy, right? Because, well, the creators get wealthy, and they're very pragmatic, and they're not ideological, so they don't really know how to defend themselves. I mean, the business community right now, if you want an example of people who just don't know how to defend themselves, they don't know what to do.
Yeah, they're defenseless because they never think that they need to defend the system that makes their prosperity possible. But they do.
They look at all the people they've hired, and they're like, I just don't understand what I'm doing wrong. Now, do some of them do things that are ethically wrong? I'm sure, but it's clearly not the norm.
No, and yeah, exactly. So what the left is good at is they're very good at making indictments. Indictments that very often apply to them and don't apply as much to the people that they're accusing. So take, for example, this idea that sort of the businessman is a greedy, selfish guy, right? So think about this. How does a businessman become successful? You become successful by and large by thinking about the wants and needs of others. That's how you make a product that other people actually want. Now contrast this with a typical intellectual. I mean, I'm even talking about a conservative intellectual, right? Yeah. I remember walking into the office at AEI of one of my colleagues, pretty well-known guy, but I won't name him. He's writing his book, and he shows me the book. And it turns out to be on some unbelievably obscure topic. So I asked him, kind of just curiously, I said, have you thought about who the audience is that would want to read your book, right? And he looks me straight in the face and goes, no. In other words, the topic interested him. He wrote a book, and then he was a little annoyed that there wasn't a long line outside Barnes & Noble to buy the book, even though he didn't give one moment's thought to the consumer of that book, right? Whereas a guy who makes a bar of soap is not even going to move until he thinks about what distinguishes my bar of soap from every other bar of soap. Why are consumers going to want this bar of soap? I've got to put myself in their place. So the entrepreneur is actually far more empathetic, far more other-oriented, if you will.
Yeah. And it's far more democratic in the way that we're all applying it. And so maybe this is what we need to end with, too, is so let's talk about that. The free market system, the Republican system, why is that more moral than the socialist system?
Because it allocates rewards entirely in proportion with what you contributed. So I mentioned earlier the valet who parks cars. Now the valet thinks, I parked the car and therefore I deserve the $30 that every guy pays to park the car. But that's not true. The truth of it is parking a car isn't worth $30. If you offered to park my car, I'd pay you $1, right? So why are they paying $30? Because it's a resort. So somebody thought of that resort. Somebody envisioned it. They built it. They got the insurance. The reason people pay more is they're paying for the entire experience. Now, the valet is simply the last guy. In one of Adam Smith's famous examples, he talks about making a pin. And he talks about the 17 operations of making a pin. Now, the last guy always thinks I made the pin. Why? Because all the other operations that made the pin are invisible to him. So he thinks I should get the full reward of the pin, but that's an optical illusion. You didn't make the pin. In fact, the pin started before you even knew, when the steel had to be brought and it had to be refined and it had to be shipped. And then that was the raw material that then had to be cut and so on. So the point is that capitalism figures all this out and creates systems that allocate rewards along the way to all the parties that are responsible collectively for making the pin. And the guy who thought of it and made it happen, he gets the largest rewards, because if it wasn't for him, none of this would occur at all.
And I think that's true. And the other, thinking about valets, the other beauty of capitalism is if you don't like what you're getting paid, because who knows what that valet guy gets paid at this resort. Maybe it's only $8 an hour. But you could get paid more if, and you see this play out, I think, in other places just around town. A valet company could start, a bunch of valets could get together. They could start a company, and they could basically rent out other parking spaces that aren't, attached to that the restaurant has nothing. They don't even know where the car is parked. But then they have a contract with the restaurant, and then you make more money with every car that you park. I mean, this is sort of the beauty of innovation and capitalism. The other thing about it, and so the counter argument, right, is that the left constantly argues that, yes, that's all fine and good. We love the free market system creating wealth, but it's still not fair. It's still not fair because there's, people didn't start at the same playing field. They didn't have the same advantages growing up. This is where they get this notion of privilege from. And I think privilege is, I think they like that word a lot, but it's an inaccurate word. There isn't really a privilege. There's advantages. And that you would, if they were using the word advantages, yes, that's true. But it's harder to assign that to specific groups, and they don't like that because they like the group on group politics. But of course, people have different advantages. I had less advantages than many. I had more advantages than many. There's a huge spectrum, different types of advantages. But in the end, some people have a harder time climbing up the ladder than others, and there's these hierarchies that we all live in. The left thinks there's maybe less hierarchies than there actually are, but it's besides the point. But they're not wrong to point out sometimes that if it's a pure meritocracy, that people do get left behind, and that there's a sense of injustice bubbling up because of that. Whether it's right or wrong, there is a sense, and that we do have an interest in at least alleviating that with social safety net programs.
Yeah, you're good. I mean, no argument from me on any of that. I mean, my argument would be this, that those very disadvantaged communities that they're pointing to, where they say, look, this is where the schools are terrible. This is where the gang substitutes for the family. This is where even if you put someone on the starting line, they're not able to compete equally in the race or effectively in the race. My answer is, yes, but you've been running those communities now for about 70 years. And you have screwed up big time. And so a little bit of modesty in admitting that would be a very good first step to fixing those communities. You're not even open to a discussion about how to make them better. Yeah. In fact, you have politically monopolized those communities, and you're terrified that if those communities did succeed, people would dust their hands off and say, who needs the Democratic Party? So once you admit all those things, we can then sit down with you and figure out how to fix those things. I think Republicans, by the way, should campaign openly on ways to fix those communities, because I think that's really ultimately what will break the back of the donkey.
Yeah, no, I think so. And we have to openly talk about school choice, opportunity zones, these things that we have long championed that would directly help these communities, and tell them, like, we're not going to pander to you. We are the party of pure honesty. These are cultural norms that work. This is what works. There are things that almost guarantee you get ahead in life. 2-parent households. So encourage 2-parent households. Maybe financial incentives that don't discourage financial incentives that don't discourage a 2-parent household. Get a job. Don't have kids before you're married, and finish high school. These basic things help people.
My wife grew up in the barrio in South Texas, Rio Grande Valley. And basically, I think if you see a Latino or black guy who's not voting for the Republican Party, it's not because they don't think the Democrats are screwing them over. They actually do know that at some level. But what they're saying is that the Republicans stand for the ladder of opportunity. I don't see a ladder. Mm-hmm. And the rhetoric of the ladder doesn't substitute for the ladder itself, right? Yeah, so I think the more that we can show them ladders and say, listen, you know what, we're not going to climb for you, but there's a ladder, and we're going to hold the ladder, and the state's job is going to be to hold that ladder. Your job is to climb, and how far you get is going to depend on your own effort and a little bit of luck. But it's going to be your journey, and you will have at the end of it the earned satisfaction that you did it. You put the ball in the basket, and you didn't go to some self-esteem seminar where people go, hey, congrats, you didn't do anything, but we're going to give you the prize. You will have the earned satisfaction of knowing that you did it, you earned it. That, I think, is a life well lived, and that's what I think conservatism stands for. So we have a tremendous recipe. We don't often do a good enough job creating the narrative to sell it.
It's hard to sell because it's not immediate. There's no immediate satisfaction with that, because, like you said, they need to see the ladder, and they need to see the ladder in the next election. Democrats understand that a lot better, and so they're willing to now they never deliver it, but they are willing to promise it over and over and over again right in that next election. One thing, because we spent so much time talking about how much, so I'm going to shift topics again, and I know we don't have much time left, but we spent a lot of time identifying the origins of where we're at now, and I want to throw out another kind of theory to you, and it's kind of twofold. One is that progressivism, even when, again, LBJ, FDR, Wilson, they always said they were anti-socialist. They never would have claimed that term. But even well-intentioned liberalism has to lead to socialism. It has to. There's no other outcome, and here's why. And it's because of this need to promise services. this need to promise to do nice things for people. And maybe it comes from a very good place. I'll give them the benefit of the doubt. It comes from a well-intentioned place. But the thing is you have to promise more the next time and the next time and the next time, because you're so used to and accustomed to saying, listen, there are still problems. You're in a meritocracy. There's always going to be people who don't succeed in that meritocracy the way others do. And you always want to be their champion, build your coalition, get elected, promise you things. Talking about buying elections, the way you buy elections is you promise people stuff and then they promise to vote for you. And this has to eventually lead to a place of completely redistributed wealth in the era or in the mindset of a socialist society.
I agree, and I'll say it a slightly different way. A professor of mine once said to me, when you meet a liberal, always ask him this question: in what society would you be a conservative? So in other words, the tax rate's 37%. The liberal wants more, right? So you say, okay, you want the taxes to go higher, but how high?
That's a great way to put it.
At what point would you stop? At what point would you say, okay, we now have 50% taxes. I'm now content, so I'm going to be conservative in opposing further tax. But you'll find that with the liberal and the progressive, you can never get them to state that point in advance. That confirms your point that there is they're a tendency. They're pushing in this direction. Another point I want to make, and maybe close on this, is Orwell's point. Orwell was a man of the left, but he recognized that even though the rhetoric of socialism is all about economic justice and so on, that the socialists can never avoid attacking civil liberties. At the end of it, they're not just about economic confiscation; they're also about tyranny. And
you have to. If you're trying to remove all inequities, you have to implement unequal treatment.
But they also are about rewriting history, and they're about forcing you to admit things even though you know they're not true. There's this great scene in 1984 where they're trying to make this guy Winston admit that 2 + 2 is 5. And Winston goes, I won't do it. He goes, you've taken my property, you've taken my family, you've destroyed my life, but I have one form of freedom left, and that is I can still think, and I will still insist that 2 + 2 is 4. And so they lock him up in a room, they turn out the lights, sensory deprivation, no food, he's scared of rats, so they put rats on him, and finally he goes, okay, I admit it, 2 + 2 is 5. Can I go now? And they're like, no, Winston, you can't go because you're only saying that because you know that's what we want to hear. We are not just about outward conformity. We want to make you believe that 2 + 2 is 5 just because the state says it is. Yeah. And at some level, that is, I think, a chilling expression of what the socialist left is all about. They want us to take a knee to what they say, even if it's the opposite of what they said yesterday.
Yeah.
They get to rewrite history, rewrite facts, rewrite things that are right in front of us and say, no, you don't see that. This kind of madness where up is down and normalcy is deviancy and vice versa, this is their game and we are their pawns. So I think there's a certain American spirit that resists this, and I'm betting that there's enough of that spirit left that we're not going to fall prey to the depredations of socialism.
I hope so. That's maybe an optimistic thing to end on, because I think it is what America is about fundamentally, is free thinkers, logical thinkers, and adherence to a republic that we can all live together peacefully in, and get back to this live and let live philosophy as opposed to trying to convince each other of untruths and trample over people's speech and rights and enforce violently conformity. I mean, there has to be a backlash to that. There just has to be.
And sometimes you have to get tough on our side to not let them get away with what they're doing on their side. And so ironically, the road to civility is not by being a namby-pamby, but actually by being a little tough and showing very little tolerance for this gangsterism that we're seeing on the other side.
You have to draw the line. This is where we might, liberal institutions are especially failing. They're not going, they don't go after conservative institutions because we fight back there. They go after liberal ones. They go after the Hollywood producers. They go after the movies. These are all, again, it's almost like this internal war in the Democratic Party. They're fighting with their own history. They're fighting with their own institutions. They're tearing at those first. They're fighting in their own cities. There's no Republicans involved in any of this. And
yet the blame is placed squarely on the Republican Party.
It's amazing to watch. And again, like conservatives have to fight for liberals. We have to fight for the liberals because they're getting trampled all over, and there will be no more liberals in the Democrat Party.
Yeah, I think that's quite true. The principles of classical liberalism are now squarely within the conservative camp.
And it's a sad thing, and we got to fight for them. Well, that was a good one. I think that was informative. We got into a lot of depth there. I told you it'd go long.
It was fun.
I
We
appreciate
covered
it,
a
Dinesh.
lot, and of course, much more than I normally can in this type of interview. So I just sort of let myself go, and I hope it works.
Yeah, no, I think people will listen to it for sure. Thanks for being on, Dinesh. It was really great.
I appreciate it.